Yeah. Alright. Well, back in, and right now I'm playing on my own. But I'm an obsessive, so we're gonna do a bit of grinding. Kill the squiggly swords, I think. They're worth a lot. And as per usual, I guess I will talk about Dark Souls while I do it. We haven't made it super far into the game yet. So lore-wise, yes, there's not a whole lot to discuss just yet. A little bit, you know, we've killed the Lost Sinner, and I think I referenced previously the you know, the connections with Izalith. That's such an interesting, like, complicated story. Ah, you and your exploding barrels. Particularly because, you know, the initial read on Izalith, I think, is that they were cursed with demonhood, and that's not... I don't think that's accurate. It was a choice. Ah! You know, there's reason to believe that everyone who became a demon chose to become a demon. And that, while there may be some downsides to it, it's not an invalid form of existence, let's say. But I do think that, how do I put it? That it's one that's chosen due to, well, pain and suffering. You know, the way the Chaos Flame demonhood, I guess, is portrayed ultimately is something mildly, or heavily, fundamentally parasitic. And that while it's a choice, it's maybe a fairly extreme choice. Made by those who didn't really see a way out. You know, so it's mentioned that, or it's implied that Izalith, had control of the Chaos Flame, pretty quickly. You know, her son is born. Her son is born, in unfortunate circumstances, and made a demon maybe against his will, because she was pregnant with him, maybe unknowingly, when the Chaos Flame was created, but her daughters chose, and she had control of this thing, early on, and you get the impression, you know, and maybe this actually happened before the War on the Dragons even, so before there was any real fear about the end of the age, let's say. I wonder if the Pursuer still shows up. But because her daughter Quelana avoids it entirely, but was aware of everything that happened, and pyromancies, which likely came about after the advent of the Chaos Flame. So she was there during something like that. Pursuer does come back. I don't necessarily want to fight him. Stick around? You gonna leave? Okay. But even, you find her oldest daughter, I believe, or at least one of her daughters, still in Izalith after the fact, and she's still in, we'll call it human form. She hasn't become a demon. She hasn't done that bonding thing. This might not be the best place to do this, being honest. So it looks like she had a choice. Anyway, but there's also the story, again, this is implied, of a betrayal in the life of Izalith, likely by her husband, and that seems to have been the thing that finally pushed her to fully embrace it. And there's a lot of themes like that in Dark Souls. Purpose, fear, pain, the loss of those things, wanting for something better, something full. And so I think, how do I put this? There's a lot of things in Dark Souls. Dark Souls, I don't know, has a conclusion per se. It doesn't have something that it wants you to, an answer that it wants you to walk away with. I think it has perspectives that it wants you to consider. And so some of those are big, broad things, let's say, like the meaning of existence. You know, should you link the fire or not? And then it's got maybe more personal themes it wants you to go over, such as, you know, your own personal place in that sort of stuff. Your own personal purpose, how to go about your own existence. And those are connected, but how they're connected is strange and it's ambiguous, and I think that's one of the things I appreciate about it, because those things are connected in real life, but they're also strange and ambiguous. You know, it's all well and good, let's say, to think about and wander through the, I guess I could have just stopped at that bonfire. I'm a dummy. The grand questions, probably worthwhile. But it doesn't necessarily answer what you're to do about it. You know, knowing that fire and darkness and the Age of Ancients are all part of some grand cycle is context. But at the end of the day, you have to live the life you're given. Dark Spirit Forlorn. Okay, I guess we're going to fucking war. Straight to war. That's fine. God, I hate invasions. Anyway. I don't know. So I think one of the more interesting themes in Dark Souls, I don't, it's, I guess, well, it's a contemplation, let's say, of depression. I think amongst the many things that Dark Souls is, it's one of the best depictions or examinations or meditations on that, on depression, the state of depression, the experience of depression, and hopefully, maybe, a way out, or at least playing with the various ways out. So, you know, you play a character who's cursed, part of the undead, and that's a thing that's on some level imposed upon you, however it comes about. And part of that is losing your memories. You have trouble remembering your life before. And yet you still, say, as a thinking being, you're sort of looking for a purpose to that, something to do. You still have to live. But you're placed on this. You're on a clock. The fate, let's say, the undead is hollowing. And I think, as we've discussed at least a little bit throughout, you know, the thing that seems to hollow a person isn't the deaths. It's the loss of purpose, the loss of meaning. You know, these undead can go, struggle, and die again and again. But it seems to be this giving into hopelessness that leads to this state of hollowing, where you're just a husk. I don't think that's demonstrated quite as effectively in Dark Souls 2, at least not yet. But there are some points in the first Dark Souls game, particularly I think when you descend into New Londo, the place is full of hollows, and it's just these, you know, empty beings, some of them pleading, some of them sitting still, some of them appearing to be in pain, but entirely oblivious to the world around them, just trapped in that state in some way. And, you know, you fight hollows. And that seems interesting, right? Because hollows are supposed to be this, like, out of stamina. These sort of empty vessel characters, right? So, you know, how can a hollow wield a sword and whatnot? But, you know, the lore take on that is that the hollows are just going through the motions of what they did in life. They, you know, soldiers are still on the same patrols they were on when they were still human, or just merely undead. Not because they have a particular will to do so, but kind of a muscle memory thing. And I think that that's a pretty good representation of the experience of depression, severe depression. This, I don't know, this sense of sort of lifeless movement that's going through the motions, that the parts of you that were vibrant and bright have been sapped away, that you leaked out in some way into dark. And I also think that it's a psychologically true observation, you know, just a clinical perspective, that the thing that holds that at bay best is a purpose. You know, the details of one's life aren't what matters. Whether good things or bad things necessarily happen to you, right? It's treated sort of like a paradox, depending on who you talk to. This idea that, you know, two people can go through the same event, even if it's horrific. Torture and imprisonment, let's say, or a concentration camp if you want to go really extreme. And one individual just, you know, it breaks them. And you can understand why. What happened to them is horrific on every level. Physically horrific, emotionally horrific, psychologically horrific, spiritually horrific. So you can understand walking away from that with this idea that there's nothing that can fix that or make it better, no out. It's entirely understandable. And you also have people, though, who will go through these kinds of experiences and they maintain themselves in some way. They hold themselves through it. You know, so you can look back on famous historical figures. Nelson Mandela is a good example. But, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think, would be an example of somebody who made it through the gulags. And Frankel, who survived the Nazi concentration camps. You know, these are people who went through these things and not only survived, but they made something out of it on some level, right? They managed to hold themselves together, to see their way through, and almost take something valuable from the experience, you know, something that they felt the need to pass on, even if that was a warning. In many cases, Solzhenitsyn, I think, definitely was a warning. I think Frankel's was a warning, but also a message of insight. You know, he talked about the process of meaning making and things like that. And that's interesting. And so, you know, you can have this sort of question that, was it something unique to Frankel that allowed him to do that? Was it something unique to Mandela? You can take that tack, but I don't think that's necessarily true. You know, I think the difference is that on some level it's not the events themselves. The events themselves are on some level meaningless before they meet the mind that interprets them, let's say. Dude, you and your exploding barrels. But we're story-making creatures. We have to make a story. causality, beginning, middle, end. And then we have to look for a why. And you can say stuff, there are people who will say that that's preposterous, and maybe it is. Looking for meaning in a meaningless world. That's the rational position, let's say. The universe is not the sort of thing that can have a purpose or preference. It can't care, and if you can't care, you can have. Maybe that's the case. I think that question is still open, philosophically speaking. I don't think we have more reason to believe one way or another. But even if that's true, the human condition is not that, and that's what you actually have. You don't get to talk your way out of the constraints of your existence, let's say, any more than you can talk your heart. You could talk your body into living without the heart beating, right? It's just a constraint of the kind of body that you have. You don't get to choose the colors you see and things like that. It just comes with the package. I think regardless of what we may believe, what we may think, I don't want to use the word believe, rationally, in our word-using brain, there is a mechanism and a drive that seeks to ascribe a meaning to things. And so some people manage on some level to ascribe a story. They can give a purpose to those events, and maybe that purpose is to tell others about it, to share the pain, let's say in the case of a horrific event, or to prevent it from happening again, or because they've gained some deep insight about what it's like to be a human, something, right? They're able to fit meaning that allows that event not to be crushing on some level. And I'm not saying that's easy, or even maybe that it's the right move. I'm not really talking about right and wrong. This isn't, I guess, a discussion of strength and weakness. It's a discussion of perspective. So, I guess in Dark Souls, you're this character who has been given this curse and a promise of hollowing, and you exist at the end of things. And you're sent out into the world, ostensibly with something to accomplish in the first game, right? You're part of this undead prophecy, one of many, ostensibly to save the world. Oh man, where'd y'all come from? But then you're sent to die. Like, the game is set up with your regular death worked in. You know, in some games when you die and you reset, let's say, you can kind of think about it as like that's the way it could have gone, but that's not the real story, right? That it's those times you lived that made up the actual story, but that's not what's happening here. It's canonical that each time you die, you did die, and then you resurrected at the bonfire to be sent out again to die. And I think that that's an applicable description on some level, being a human, and definitely this of living with depression. This ever-present sense of futility and this knowledge that you're going, maybe knowledge isn't the right word, feeling? It feels like knowing that you're going to fail, that you're not the great hero who survives but that you're going to go out there and you're going to face huge odds and they're going to kill you in all the ways that matter. But that you're still going to have to be there and escape. And that is awful. Like, that's an awful feeling. The idea that your life exists just to suffer and fail. But I think I find it interesting that amidst all of that, to the level that success can be achieved, let's say in Dark Souls, because there's still the ever, like, is it even worth fire? Should you usher in an age of dark? Things like that. We'll leave that to the side for now. Your character achieves what they do because they struggled. You meet a lot of people on a lot of quests, and almost all of them, in the end, hollow. They have a goal, they have a dream, they have something that they believe in that they want to achieve. Something that pulls them forward. And they follow that, and it keeps them alive, but over time, you watch that dream fade, fail them, and eventually they become nothing. What is it that they're fighting and dying for so often? What is it that they're suffering for? And without that justification, there's nothing inside them. There's no fire, there's no energy to keep them progressing, to move their limbs. They just stop where they are. But you don't, right? It's the point of your character. You don't do that. You fight, and you die. And you very slowly, incrementally, gather the things that you need. And you become stronger. You take the power of the things that try to kill you. And you build it inside yourself, right? You know, so what are we gathering? We're gathering souls. This substance of life. Sometimes from small characters like this, sometimes from great big monster beasts, but we're always gathering souls. And within, say, within the lore, that's what we're kindling. The reason you're sending undead on this quest, the reason that we need to go gather these things is because it's that life force that's going to become the kindling. We're kindling the flame, right? It's going to become the thing that burns, the fuel source and the kindling for this fire of a new age. If you showed up as you were at the beginning, there wouldn't be enough of you. This game says that very overtly. You know, our wife there, you know, says that we're supposed to seek these Lord souls and whatnot. I think it's the witches at the beginning, or maybe King Vendrick, who we haven't met yet. But he says, you know, seek adversity. Seek suffering. You know, if you're going to walk this path, if you're going to attempt to coalesce these things and pull them together, then you have to go where it's hard. You can't sit down. You can't seek comfort. You have to seek struggle and suffering. In doing so, you're going to gather the necessary resources. Ooh, that's a door. And ability. To, you know, kindle the first flame or become a lord, depending on kind of who you're talking about. And there's a lot of interesting discussions about, I think, purpose there. The implication that, let's say Gwyn's Age of Fire was prolonged more than it should have been. That the dark itself was a natural part of the cycle that was kept at bay due to fear of the unknown, fear of losing things. I think that plays into it, but that's a much more complicated discussion. I think that's one of the reasons that I love Artorias as a character. You know, Artorias was a Knight of Gwyn, a being of iron will, as it's put, unshakable, run at enemies. And ultimately he succumbs to the abyss. And, you know, there's a lot of self-sacrifice that goes into that. I think the idea that he had to make a covenant to even traverse the abyss is telling, thematically consistent, poignant. But, you know, actually we'll switch tracks to that. Because throughout the games, you're going to hear some discussions of dark in the abyss. And there does seem to be a distinction between those things. But it's hard to maybe piece together exactly what that is, because most people are operating with an agenda in this game. A particular perspective and a certain set of information. So you can't always assume that what somebody is telling you is 100% accurate. They may be mistaken, or they may be trying to manipulate you, or they may be equivocating, telling you some truths, but not all truths. And, but within the series, the dark itself is often described as gentle. Early on, you see these little humanity sprites and whatnot. They're described as gentle humanity. Later on, we're going to meet a little painter girl, and she's going to describe it as gentle, peaceful. Within this game, we're going to have... There's this thing between kings and queens, and we'll get into that when it shows up in the story, but in one of my favorite stories of the kings and queens here, they specifically describe the effect of this dark creature on the kingdom at large as peaceful, this great calming of things. Though that's not necessarily, seen as positive. It's part of the indication of the dark as opposed to fire. Fire is lively and vibrant. But, we've seen creatures like Manus, and he was anything but peaceful. And, but there's also, lore reasons and implications for that. And so, maybe in the same way that, the Age of Fire, the Age of Light, we often associate light with goodness, rightness, righteousness, and unambiguously so. And I think Dark Souls allows a higher level of ambiguity to these sorts of things. There were wonderful things about the Age of Fire. I love the tales of Artorias and the knights slaying dragons. Talking with the giant, with Hawkeye Go. Golf. It's golf. Even sure. Genuinely love it. You get this impression of this character who led a life of adventure, failure, achievement, found friends and companions who they miss dearly, because the things that they did together, the things that they accomplished were tremendous. And it feels beautiful. You can understand the longing there. Maybe this is our best bet. You can understand what he's reminiscing on some level. And so, part of the Age of Fire was heroes and glories and kingdoms and magic and all this, and you can understand why no one would want to give that up. But the Age of Fire was also war and strife. The figurehead of it, Gwen, lied terribly about lots of things, often acted out of fear, pride, wrath, in ways that actively harms things. And so it wasn't an untrammeled good, let's say. There was a dark side to the Age of Fire, and I think a similar thing is being said about the Dark. Now, there's some stuff... We know a bit more about the Ringed City and the actual history of humanity and any of these sorts of things. This will become more clear. But the Abyss seems to be a potential aspect of the Dark. Thank you, iframes. But not its particular essence. It's not what it is. It's a thing it can be. That's monstrous and bestial, right? That's Artorias when we see him for the battle, and that's Manus when we find him at the base of the Abyss. But it's worth noting that it was implied that Manus rested peacefully, but was torn from that in some way, and that seems to have driven his humanity wild, or I think is how it's put. And, you know, I also agree that that's a part of those sets of feelings. I think that's phenomenologically accurate, let's say. Within that depression, within those feelings. Can I make that jump? Oh, sure can. There's a guy up here, wasn't there? Not anymore. You know, there's an aspect of it which is quiet and calm. But there's also it can easily turn ravenous and violent. This sense of struggling against something that just eats you until you just want something to destroy yourself, another, doesn't matter. We're talking in a state kind of beyond simple efficacy and rationality. It's the desire to rend. You know, one of the things I guess we'll discover about the early age of all of this is the binding of humanity's nature in some way. That seems to be the thing. If it's not the thing that created the Abyss as we see it, then it's certainly guaranteed its presence. You know, say the Abyss, the ravenous, consumptive side of all of this is a natural part of the Dark, but it shows up under certain circumstances, and in binding it, sort of guaranteed that it would turn feral, that was its only release. And, you know, so when you meet Artorias, you know, he hasn't simply been touched by the darkness, but
lest this land swallow you.
He's become bound to the inherent torment and rage to that side of things. You know, Manus is the reason you get pulled into Ulasil. The reason we have to do the things that we do. You need to have freed Dusk for sure, but you also need that piece of a pendant, and it's one half of a pendant that that belonged to Manus obviously holds some sort of deep sentimental value. And you know, so I guess the question is, well, and we never had this conversation with Dusk because I couldn't find her, but she talks about being trapped inside of Manus's being, and the sense of grief and loss and pain and fear, and that seems to have become his existence. This giant, terrifying creature of the dark is that. Those are the things that make up his being at this point. It's fun to speculate and wonder what it is that was taken from him. What is it that he lost? How is it that he's failed? Where does this pain come from? But, you know, at the end of the day, it's that which drives his... it's that which sort of drives his energy. Sorry, I have to do some math real quick. I think we're going to have to start working on vitality again soon. And so, you know, maybe it's not the dark per se, but the combination of the dark and suffering, which is greatly horrific. And how does that play into our discussion about depression? It's complicated, for sure. How does that play in with the conversation about the demons in Izalith, right? This creating of a flame which is parasitic and feeds off of the human essence, right? It feeds off of the dark soul on some level, and that seems to grant a certain power and vibrancy outside of simply fire, but it also consumes you and eats you and alters you in some way. You know, there's a lot to be discussed there. Unfortunately, my lunch break is ending, and we have successfully farmed a lot of individuals, so I'll leave this lore through here. This isn't so much a lore through, maybe more of a thematic discussion. Just something I've been thinking about a lot while I wait for enough of this game to open up for us to really discuss the stories. Maybe move a little further, we'll talk about the Lost Sinner some. Anyway, for the two people who may have listened to this, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you gained something. Maybe, you know, impetus, go look more into this from better lore masters than I. But next time we'll go kill some more stuff. Yeah.